There comes a moment in your life when you realize that the battle was never about them. It was always about you discovering your own power. You spent time trying to be understood, trying to be valued, trying to be seen by someone who was never designed to see beyond themselves. But today, something shifts. Today, you stop negotiating your worth. Today, you rise into a version of yourself that no longer seeks approval, but commands respect. Respect is often misunderstood as something that must be earned through pleasing others, being agreeable, or constantly proving your value. But in reality, respect is not a reward handed to you by someone else. It is a standard you establish through how you allow yourself to be treated. When dealing with individuals who thrive on control and manipulation, this distinction becomes even more critical. They are not scanning for kindness or sincerity. They are scanning for weakness, inconsistency, and emotional access points. If they detect that your boundaries shift depending on pressure, they will test those boundaries repeatedly until they find a way in. The truth is, boundaries are not just words you speak, they are behaviors you demonstrate. Anyone can say, "I won't tolerate this." But if your actions do not align with that statement, the words lose all power. Boundaries only become real when they are enforced consistently, without hesitation and without emotional negotiation. This is where most people struggle. They set limits, but the moment those limits are challenged, they begin to explain, justify, or soften their stance. And in that moment, the message becomes unclear. When the message is unclear, the other person interprets it as flexibility. And flexibility to a manipulative personality is an invitation. Enforcing boundaries does not require aggression. It does not require raised voices or dramatic confrontations. In fact, the most powerful boundaries are quiet, firm, and non-negotiable. It is the ability to say no and remain steady in that decision, even when the other person reacts with frustration, guilt-tripping, or attempts to provoke you emotionally. When you hold your ground without being pulled into their emotional storm, you communicate something far more powerful than words. You demonstrate self-control and self-respect. What many people fail to realize is that inconsistency is the greatest enemy of respect. If today you tolerate something that yesterday you rejected, you create confusion. And confusion benefits the manipulator because it gives them room to test you again. But when your responses are consistent, predictable, and aligned with your values, you remove that uncertainty. Over time, the other person learns that your standards are not temporary, they are permanent. And once that realization sets in, their behavior begins to adjust. Not because they suddenly developed empathy, but because they recognize the limits of what they can and cannot do. There is also a psychological shift that happens within you when you begin to enforce boundaries properly. You stop seeking approval and you start prioritizing alignment with your own principles. This internal shift is what strengthens your presence. You are no longer reacting to gain acceptance. You are responding based on self-respect. And people can sense that difference. It changes your tone, your posture, your decisions, and even your silence. You become less accessible to manipulation because your actions are no longer driven by fear of losing someone or fear of conflict. It is important to understand that when you begin enforcing boundaries, there may be resistance. The very people who benefited from your lack of boundaries will feel uncomfortable when those boundaries are introduced. They may accuse you of changing, becoming distant, or being difficult. But what they are really responding to is the loss of control. And if you allow their reaction to make you retreat, you reinforce the idea that your boundaries are negotiable. That is why consistency is essential, not just in calm moments, but especially in moments of pressure. Respect grows in the space where your words and actions match. When you say something and follow through, you build credibility. And credibility is the foundation of authority. Without it, boundaries are just suggestions. With it, they become standards that others learn to recognize and adapt to. This is why you must be willing to accept the consequences of your boundaries. If you say you will walk away from disrespect, then you must be prepared to do exactly that. Not as a threat, but as a commitment to yourself. Over time, something powerful begins to happen. The same behavior that once challenged you starts to diminish. The same person who once tested your limits begins to approach you with more caution. Not because they have changed internally, but because they have learned externally that your boundaries are real. You have shifted the dynamic by changing your response pattern. And this is where true respect begins to form, not from emotional persuasion, not from convincing someone of your worth, but from demonstrating that your standards are unwavering. You teach people how to treat you not through explanation, but through enforcement. Every action you take either reinforces your value or diminishes it. Every time you tolerate what you once rejected, you lower the standard. Every time you stand firm, you raise it. So the goal is not to control the other person. The goal is to control yourself, your responses, your decisions, and your consistency. Because once you master that, you no longer need to demand respect. It becomes a natural response to the environment you create. Fear in this context is not the trembling weakness people often imagine. It is something far more subtle and psychological. It is the quiet discomfort that arises when control begins to slip away. A narcissistic personality does not fear strength in the way most people define it. They do not fear loud voices, aggressive reactions, or emotional outbursts. In fact, those things often empower them. Why? Because emotional reactions are predictable, and anything predictable can be controlled. What truly unsettles them is unpredictability born from emotional independence. You must understand that their sense of power is not rooted in internal stability. It is built on external influence. Their confidence depends on their ability to shape your emotions, to provoke you, to confuse you, and to keep you engaged in a cycle where they remain at the center. The moment that cycle is disrupted, something begins to change within them. Not externally at first, but internally. When you stop reacting the way they expect, their internal system begins to malfunction. Imagine someone who has spent years mastering a specific pattern. They say something hurtful, you react emotionally. They withdraw, you chase. They criticize, you defend. This pattern becomes their map of control. But one day you respond differently. You do not react. You do not chase. You do not defend. You remain calm, grounded, and clear. In that moment, their map becomes useless. And when the map no longer works, uncertainty begins. Uncertainty is the birthplace of fear. Not fear of you as a person, but fear of losing their psychological grip. Because if they cannot predict you, they cannot control you. And if they cannot control you, they lose the very foundation on which their sense of dominance is built. This is why emotional detachment is not weakness, it is strategy. It is not about becoming cold or distant in a negative sense. It is about becoming centered. It is about responding from a place of clarity rather than reacting from a place of emotion. You see, reaction is submission. Response is authority. When you react, you are giving them access. You are showing them the buttons they can press to influence your state. But when you respond with intention or choose not to respond at all, you remove that access entirely. And here is where the shift becomes powerful. They begin to test you. They may escalate their behavior. They may try new tactics. They may become more provocative, more subtle, or even temporarily charming. But all of these are attempts to regain control, to reestablish the pattern that once worked so effectively. If you remain consistent, calm, firm, and unmoved, you send a message without speaking a word. You no longer have authority over my emotional world. That message is louder than any argument. And over time, something begins to happen. Their approach changes, not necessarily because they respect you in a moral sense, but because they recognize a boundary they cannot penetrate. And people, regardless of their personality, adjust to what they cannot break. This is the moment where what you call fear begins to appear. Again, not fear of harm, but fear of irrelevance, fear of losing influence, fear of being unable to affect you, because influence is their currency, and you have just taken it away. But listen carefully, this transformation requires discipline. It is not a one-time decision. It is a consistent way of being. You must train yourself to pause before reacting, to observe rather than absorb, to understand that not every action requires a response, and not every statement deserves your energy. You are not avoiding the situation, you are mastering it. And mastery always looks quiet. There will be moments when you feel the urge to explain yourself, to defend your position, to prove your intentions. But you must ask yourself, am I doing this to communicate or to seek validation? Because if it is validation, you are stepping back into the cycles. True strength is the ability to stand in your truth without needing others to agree with it. When you reach that level, you become grounded. And grounded individuals are very difficult to manipulate. They do not sway with every opinion. They do not collapse under pressure. They do not lose themselves in someone else's narrative. They remain. And that stability creates a psychological shift in the other person. Because now, instead of leading the dynamic, they are reacting to it. And that is unfamiliar territory. So they begin to respect your space, not out of kindness, but out of recognition. Recognition that the old methods no longer work. Recognition that you are no longer accessible in the same way. And that is where your power truly lies, not in controlling them, but in no longer being controlled. So understand this deeply. The goal is not to make them fear you. The goal is to become so self-controlled, so emotionally independent, and so internally secure that their need to control you becomes ineffective. Because when control fails, influence fades. And when influence fades, the entire dynamic changes. Not because they chose to change, but because you did. When you begin to understand emotional detachment, you step into a level of strength that most people never reach. Not because it is complicated, but because it requires discipline over your inner world. Emotional detachment does not mean you stop feeling. It means you stop allowing your feelings to be controlled, provoked, or weaponized against you. And this is where your power begins to multiply. You must recognize that a manipulative personality studies your reactions more than your words. They observe what hurts you, what excites you, what triggers you, and what makes you doubt yourself. Then they use that information as a map, a strategy to control the direction of your emotions. If you react, they adjust. If you argue, they escalate. If you defend, they confuse. This is not random behavior, it is calculated. Now imagine what happens when that map becomes useless. When your reactions are no longer predictable, their strategy begins to collapse. When they push and you remain calm, when they provoke and you remain grounded, when they attempt to create chaos and you choose silence, you introduce something they are not prepared for: emotional independence. Emotional detachment is not weakness. It is not avoidance. It is not suppression. It is control. It is the ability to feel something deeply and still choose your response wisely. It is the power to experience anger without becoming destructive, to experience hurt without becoming desperate, and to experience confusion without losing your identity. This kind of control does something very important. It breaks the cycle. Because manipulation only works when there is participation. It requires your emotional engagement to survive. It feeds on your reactions. It grows through your responses. But when you stop participating at the emotional level they expect, you starve the system that was designed to trap you. You must train yourself to pause. Not react immediately, not respond impulsively. There is power in the space between what happens to you and how you respond to it. In that space lies your freedom. In that space lies your authority. In that space lies your ability to choose who you become, instead of reacting based on what someone else has done. And let this be clear, emotional detachment does not mean you tolerate disrespect. It means you address it without losing yourself. It means your response is intentional, not emotional. It means your decisions are guided by clarity, not by temporary feelings. There is a difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is automatic. It is driven by emotion, often without thought. Response is deliberate. It is chosen, measured, and aligned with your values. When you master this difference, you become dangerous, not in a destructive way, but in a way that makes you untouchable. Because now no one can control you through your emotions. And when that happens, something shifts internally. You begin to feel less anxious, less pressured, less confused. Why? Because you are no longer living in reaction to someone else's behavior. You are no longer waiting for their approval, their validation, or their mood to determine your peace. You become stable, and stability is intimidating to those who rely on chaos. They expect you to argue. You remain calm. They expect you to chase. You step back. They expect you to explain. You stay silent. This unpredictability creates discomfort for them. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are no longer playing the role they assigned to you. And here's the truth most people miss. The moment you detach emotionally, you begin to see clearly. You start recognizing patterns you once ignored. You start understanding behaviors you once questioned. You start identifying manipulation where you once saw confusion. Clarity replaces chaos, and with clarity comes confidence. You stop second-guessing yourself. You stop overthinking every interaction. You stop carrying emotional weight that was never yours to begin with. You realize that their behavior is not a reflection of your worth, but a projection of their own limitations. That realization alone can change your entire life. Because now you are no longer trying to fix what was never yours to fix. You are no longer trying to prove what does not need to be proven. You are no longer trying to earn what should have been given freely, basic respect. Instead, you operate from a place of self-sufficiency. You validate yourself. You ground yourself. You protect your energy. And when you reach that level, you no longer fear losing people who cannot respect you. In fact, you begin to welcome the distance, because you understand that peace is more valuable than approval. This is the transformation, not loud, not dramatic, but powerful. You don't announce it, you embody it. And those who once thought they had control over you will begin to feel something unfamiliar, a loss of influence, a loss of access, a loss of power, not because you fought them, but because you outgrew the need to respond to them. And that is what emotional detachment truly is. It is growth. It is discipline. It is freedom. And once you experience that freedom, you will never go back to being controlled by someone else's behavior again. Clarity of identity is one of the most powerful psychological defenses you can ever develop, because confusion is the environment where manipulation thrives. When a person does not fully understand who they are, what they stand for, and what they will or will not tolerate, they become vulnerable to external influence. A narcissistic personality studies this vulnerability carefully. They do not need to overpower you physically. They simply need to destabilize your sense of self. Once your identity becomes unclear, your decisions become uncertain. And once your decisions become uncertain, your behavior becomes predictable and therefore controllable. This is why you may find yourself questioning your own thoughts after interacting with such individuals. You begin to wonder, am I overreacting? Am I too sensitive? Am I the problem? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are signs that your internal clarity is being challenged. The goal of manipulation is not just to control your actions, but to rewrite your perception of reality. If someone can make you doubt your own mind, they no longer need to argue with you. You will begin to argue with yourself. But the moment you develop clarity of identity, everything changes. When you're clear about your values, your standards, and your emotional boundaries, you no longer rely on external validation to confirm your reality. You do not need someone else to agree with you in order to trust your own judgment. This is where psychological independence begins. And psychological independence is something that cannot be easily controlled. Clarity means you know what respect looks like to you. It means you recognize when something violates your peace without needing a second opinion. It means you understand your emotional responses and trust them as signals, not weaknesses. When someone attempts to confuse you, you do not absorb their version of reality. You evaluate it. And if it does not align with your truth, you reject it without guilt. One of the most important aspects of identity clarity is self-definition. If you do not define yourself, someone else will attempt to define you. They may label you as difficult, overly emotional, selfish, or unreasonable, not because it is true, but because it benefits their control. And if you accept those labels without question, you begin to shrink into a version of yourself that is easier to manage. However, when you define yourself, those labels lose their power. If you know you are a person who values respect, then being called difficult for setting boundaries no longer confuses you. It becomes confirmation that you are standing firm. If you know you are emotionally aware, then being called too sensitive does not weaken you. It reminds you that you are connected to your inner world in a way they may not understand. Clarity also brings consistency, and consistency is what builds psychological strength. When your identity is clear, your actions align with your values. You do not behave one way today and another way tomorrow based on someone else's influence. This consistency makes you stable, and stability is something that manipulative individuals struggle to penetrate because their strategies rely on emotional fluctuation. Another critical element of clarity is emotional responsibility. This means you take ownership of your feelings without allowing others to weaponize them against you. You understand that your emotions are valid, but you also understand that not every emotion requires a reaction. This balance allows you to remain grounded, even when someone is attempting to provoke you. When your identity is unclear, you react quickly because you are trying to protect something that feels unstable. But when your identity is clear, you respond thoughtfully because you are protecting something that is already secure. There is a difference between reacting from fear and responding from strength. And here is where the dynamic truly shifts. When someone realizes they can no longer confuse you, they lose their primary tool of control. They may attempt to escalate, to provoke, to push harder, but without your internal confusion, their efforts begin to fail. You are no longer operating in their constructed reality. You are standing firmly in your own. This does not mean the situation becomes easy. In fact, sometimes it becomes more challenging because you are no longer participating in patterns that once kept the peace. But what you gain is far more valuable than temporary comfort. You gain self-respect, emotional stability, and personal authority. Clarity of identity is not something that happens overnight. It is developed through self-reflection, through understanding your values, through recognizing your patterns, and through making decisions that align with who you truly are. It requires honesty with yourself, even when that honesty is uncomfortable. It requires the courage to stand alone in your truth, even when others disagree. But once you reach that level of clarity, you become anchored. And an anchored person cannot be easily moved. You are no longer drifting in someone else's narrative. You are grounded in your own. And when you are grounded in who you are, manipulation loses its power because it no longer has a place to attach itself. Silence is often misunderstood as weakness, but in reality it is one of the most powerful forms of communication a person can master. Most people are conditioned to believe that in order to be heard, they must speak louder, argue harder, or explain themselves more clearly. But what they fail to recognize is that excessive explanation often reveals a deeper insecurity, the need to be validated. And when you're dealing with someone who thrives on control and manipulation, every explanation you offer becomes material they can use against you. When you choose silence, you are not withdrawing, you're repositioning. You are stepping out of a reactive state and entering a place of control. You are deciding that your energy is too valuable to be spent on conversations that are designed to confuse, provoke, or diminish you. Silence, in this sense, is not avoidance, it is strategic restraint. Understand this clearly. Manipulation feeds on engagement. It requires your participation. It needs your emotions, your words, your reactions. Without your involvement, the entire structure begins to collapse. So when you refuse to argue, when you refuse to defend yourself against false accusations, when you refuse to respond to provocations, you are not losing. You are disrupting the system that was built to control you. There is a discipline in silence that most people never develop. It requires emotional intelligence. It requires self-awareness. It requires the ability to feel something deeply and still choose not to react impulsively. That is not easy. In fact, it goes against human instinct. But growth has never been about doing what is easy. It has always been about doing what is necessary. Silence gives you space. Space to think. Space to observe. Space to understand what is really happening beneath the surface. While the other person is busy trying to provoke you, you are studying patterns. You are recognizing behaviors. You are seeing clearly without the distortion of emotional chaos. And clarity is power. There is also a psychological impact that silence creates. When someone expects a reaction and does not receive it, it unsettles them. It disrupts their sense of control. It forces them into uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable for those who rely on predictability to manipulate others. They are used to pushing a button and getting a response. But when the button stops working, they begin to question their influence. Silence, therefore, becomes a mirror. It reflects their behavior back to them without interference. It exposes their tactics without you having to point them out. And often what is revealed in that reflection is something they are not prepared to face. But let us be clear, this is not about playing games. This is not about giving someone the silent treatment out of anger or revenge. That kind of silence is still emotional, still reactive, still connected to the need to prove a point. Strategic silence is different. It is calm. It is intentional. It is rooted in self-respect, not ego. You are not silent because you have nothing to say. You are silent because you understand that not everything deserves your response. There is a level of maturity where you begin to realize that your peace is more important than being right, that your energy is more valuable than winning an argument, that your time is too precious to be wasted on conversations that lead nowhere. And once you reach that level, your behavior changes. You stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop defending yourself against accusations that are designed to provoke you. You stop engaging in cycles that only drain you. And instead you stand in quiet confidence. Now here is where the transformation becomes undeniable. When you consistently practice this level of restraint, people begin to experience you differently. They may not understand it at first. They may even try harder to provoke you. But over time, they recognize something has changed. The person they once controlled is no longer accessible in the same way. And that realization creates a shift. Because when access is limited, value increases. When reactions disappear, curiosity grows. When chaos is met with calm, power becomes visible. You are no longer participating in the dysfunction, you are rising above it. And that is what makes silence so powerful. It is not just the absence of words, it is the presence of control, awareness, and strength. It is a declaration that you are no longer available for manipulation. It is a boundary that does not need to be spoken because it is felt. So the next time you are tempted to argue, to explain, to prove your point, pause. Ask yourself whether the conversation is truly constructive or if it is simply another attempt to pull you into a cycle that serves no purpose. And if it is the latter, choose silence, not because you are weak, but because you are strong enough to walk away from what no longer deserves your voice. Consistency is the silent force that transforms temporary strength into permanent authority. Anyone can act strong for a moment. Anyone can set a boundary once. Anyone can say no when they are pushed to their limit. But what separates a moment of strength from a life of respect is the ability to repeat that behavior without wavering, without collapsing, and without seeking approval afterward. The challenge is not in knowing what to do, it is in doing it again and again, especially when it feels uncomfortable. Because consistency will test your identity. It will expose whether your boundaries are real or just emotional reactions. A person who operates with manipulation watches patterns, not words. They study your behavior over time. If you're strong today but weak tomorrow, kind today but overly available the next, firm today but apologetic later, you create confusion. And confusion invites control. You must understand that inconsistency sends a message. It tells others that your standards are negotiable. It tells them that if they push long enough, you will eventually bend. And once that belief is formed, respect begins to erode, not because you lack value, but because your value is not being reinforced through your actions. Consistency, on the other hand, builds something powerful, predictability of standards. Not predictability of emotions, but predictability of principles. When people know that your no will remain no tomorrow, next week, and next month, they stop testing it. When they realize that your silence is not temporary but intentional, they stop trying to provoke you. When they see that your boundaries are not emotional reactions but established rules, they begin to adjust their behavior. This is where authority is born, not from dominance, not from control, but from stability. Stability is intimidating to those who rely on instability to function. If someone cannot shake you, they cannot shape you. And if they cannot shape you, they cannot control the outcome of their interaction with you. But consistency requires discipline. It requires you to act in alignment with your values, even when your emotions are pulling you in a different direction. There will be moments when you feel the urge to explain yourself, to justify your decisions, to soften your boundaries, just to keep the peace. And in those moments, you must remember that peace built on self-betrayal is not peace. It is quiet suffering. True consistency means you honor your standards even when it costs you comfort, even when it costs you approval, even when it costs you a relationship that was built on your willingness to tolerate less than you deserve. And here is the deeper truth. Consistency is not about being rigid. It is about being rooted. A tree that is rooted deeply does not move with every wind. It may bend, but it does not break. In the same way, a person who is consistent is not controlled by external pressure. They may adapt their approach, but they do not abandon their principles. Over time, this creates a shift in perception. People begin to see you differently, not because you announced your worth, but because you demonstrated it repeatedly. Words can be doubted, emotions can be questioned, but consistent behavior becomes undeniable evidence of who you are. And once that evidence is established, something changes in the dynamic. The same people who once tested your limits begin to respect them, not out of admiration, but out of recognition. Recognition that you are no longer someone whose boundaries can be negotiated. This is where many people make a mistake. They think respect comes from confrontation or intensity, but real respect comes from reliability, from knowing that who you are today is who you will be tomorrow, that your standards are not temporary moods but permanent decisions. You are not trying to prove strength, you are living it. And the more you live it, the less you need to defend it. Because consistency removes the need for explanation. Your actions begin to speak before your words ever do. Your presence begins to communicate what you will and will not accept without you needing to announce it. That is authority. That is power. And that is what makes someone who once ignored your boundaries begin to take you seriously. Not because they suddenly became better, but because you became unmovable. And when you become unmovable, you become undeniable. Your self-worth is the invisible script that teaches the world how to treat you. Long before anyone speaks to you, responds to you, or decides how much respect to give you, they are reading signals, subtle, unspoken signals that come from within you. These signals are not about what you say, they are about what you believe. Because what you believe about yourself determines what you tolerate, what you accept, and what you unconsciously invite into your life. When a person has not yet anchored their value internally, they often look outward for validation. They seek approval, reassurance, and acceptance from others, hoping that these things will confirm their worth. But this creates a dangerous cycle. The more you depend on others to define your value, the more power you give them to control how you feel about yourself. And those who thrive on control will quickly recognize this dependency. They will test your limits, push your boundaries, and observe how much you are willing to endure just to maintain connection. But when you begin to develop a strong sense of self-worth, something shifts at a foundational level. You no longer negotiate your value in conversations, in relationships, or in moments of conflict. You stop explaining yourself excessively. You stop chasing understanding from those who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop trying to prove that you deserve basic respect. Why? Because you have already settled that question within yourself. Self-worth is not arrogance. It is not about believing you are better than others. It is about understanding that your value is not up for debate. It is about recognizing that you do not need to shrink, perform, or overextend yourself to be worthy of dignity. And when this understanding becomes deeply rooted, it begins to influence your behavior in powerful ways. You start to say no without guilt, not because you are trying to be difficult, but because you are no longer afraid of disappointing others. You begin to walk away from situations that drain your energy, even if it means being misunderstood. You become selective with your time, your attention, and your emotional investment. And this selectivity is not rejection, it is alignment. It is the natural result of knowing what you deserve and refusing to settle for less. People notice this change even if they cannot fully explain it. There is a difference in your presence. You are no longer easily persuaded, easily shaken, or easily controlled. Your reactions become measured. Your words become intentional. Your silence becomes meaningful. And in that space, something powerful happens. You become respected. Not because you demanded it, but because you demonstrated it. You see, respect is not built on what you say you deserve. It is built on what you consistently accept. If you accept disrespect, you train others to continue it. If you tolerate inconsistency, you normalize instability. But when you consistently reinforce your standards through your actions, you create a new pattern. And people, whether consciously or unconsciously, begin to adapt to that pattern. This is why self-worth is the foundation of every healthy boundary. Without it, boundaries feel like punishment, both to you and to others. But with it, boundaries become a natural extension of who you are. They are no longer something you force, they are something you embody. And here is the deeper truth. When your self-worth is strong, you are no longer threatened by how others behave. Their disrespect does not define you. Their manipulation does not confuse you. Their absence does not diminish you. You are stable within yourself, and that stability becomes your greatest strength. This is what changes the dynamic with those who rely on control. When they realize that your sense of self is no longer dependent on their approval, they lose their leverage. They can no longer use guilt to influence you. They can no longer use silence to provoke you. They can no longer use confusion to destabilize you. And in the absence of control, they are left with only two options: adjust their behavior or lose access to you. So the journey is not about making others respect you. It is about becoming the version of yourself that naturally commands respect. A version that does not beg for attention but does not tolerate neglect. A version that does not chase validation but does not accept disrespect. A version that stands firm, not in pride but in clarity. And when you reach that level, everything changes. Your relationships change. Your standards change. Your environment changes because you have changed. And it all begins with one decision: the decision to see yourself clearly, to value yourself deeply, and to never again allow your worth to be determined by someone who has not yet discovered their own.